Good evening. I'm Barbara Stevenson, and I'm the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Chief Global Officer here at Carolina. Welcome to tonight's diplomatic discussion. You know, when I first joined Carolina in September of 2019, I invited Stu Eizenstat to come to Carolina to speak at my very first Global Leadership Council event right here in the Global Education Center in the atrium. During my 34 years in the United States Foreign Service, I had a chance to see Ambassador Eisenstat's work up close. When I was a special assistant for Europe for the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Eizenstat was the Undersecretary for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs. The two undersecretaries worked together to build bonds that have underpinned the transatlantic relationship for the last 25 years or more. When I look back, I see that as the major achievement that it was. And so when I needed a speaker for a very special event when I was new to the university, Ambassador Eizenstat, a Tar Heel himself, came through for me, and he gave a brilliant talk on the rising challenges to democracy around the world, and that seems prescient now. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing speaker series, Diplomatic Discussions, which brings foreign affairs practitioners to Carolina. Diplomatic discussions are a core component of what has grown into Carolina's Diplomacy Initiative, which will soon expand, students listen up, to include Carolina Diplomacy Fellows, a cohort of students who will move through the offerings of the Diplomacy Initiative and earn digital badges. More on this in the new year in the January-February timeframe, but you're going to love it. While the Diplomacy Initiative has taken shape over the years since Ambassador Eizenstat was the first visiting foreign affairs practitioner during my tenure, it is still a work in progress. And as we have grappled with how best to describe its purpose and how to articulate what we're trying to achieve here, I am inspired by the introduction to Ambassador Eisenstat's new book, The Art of Diplomacy. Ambassador Eizenstat writes in the introduction, "The ability to build trust is essential, as are a high degree of intelligence, patience, stamina, and preparation. An effective negotiator will listen carefully to the other side and empathize, if not agree, with the other side's perspective. The ability to compromise without abandoning one's core principles and interests has proved a necessary element in every successful negotiation. This skill, the ability to listen carefully to the other side and even empathize, if not agree, it is crucial. It's core to what we hope Carolina Diplomacy Fellows master. In so many cases, when we grapple with global challenges, it is simply not an option to walk away from them. We must find a way forward. And the ability to listen carefully in the search for common ground is very often essential to finding that way forward. So tonight, Ambassador Eizenstat will, for about 15 minutes, tell stories from some of the most monumental diplomatic triumphs in modern American history. He will share with us what Henry Kissinger called in his foreword to the book, a framework for conducting diplomacy. Tonight's event is possible because of a few key folks that I'd like to recognize. I'm so thankful to Carolina's Center for European Studies that you've joined us tonight as a co-sponsor. Our area study centers are one of the standout strengths here at Carolina. Established in 1993, the Center for European Studies is one of only 6 in the entire country to be designated as both a National Resource Center by the U.S. Department of Education and a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence by the European Union. And what's more, UNC Chapel Hill is only one of a literal handful of American universities to host 6 Title VI National Resource Centers, a particular point of pride and a foundational strength to build on. Joining Ambassador Eizenstat after his talk for a fireside chat around 6 o'clock or a little before then will be David Price, one of North Carolina's most distinguished and well-loved public servants. An ardent fan of the Title VI program, David Price served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 34 years, representing us, North Carolina's 4th District, through many changes and challenges. He earned degrees from Mars Hill College, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Yale University. For many years, he taught at Duke University and chaired the state's Democratic Party before running for Congress. During his time in Washington, D.C., he served on various committees, including the House Appropriations Committee, and is chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, and related agencies. Price also chaired the House Democracy Partnership, a bipartisan commission he initiated to work with and strengthen representative institutions in emerging democracies. After Ambassador Eisenstat's presentation, Congressman Price will go deeper into the book in a fireside chat, and then following their conversation, I'll return to the podium around 6:30 so that we can take questions from you in the audience, and you'll at that point line up behind these 2 mics to ask your question. After that, there will be pizza and a reception, so it'll be a great evening. Now let me briefly tell you about our main guest tonight. Ambassador Stu Eizenstat serves Secretary of State Antony Blinken as Special Advisor on Holocaust issues. He held the same advisory position for Secretaries of State Hillary Rodham Clinton and John Kerry, and he served as an expert advisor on Holocaust issues during the Trump administration. He is the former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, that's right, the #2 official at the Department of Treasury, it's a big deal, Undersecretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to President Carter. He recommended to President Carter that he create the Presidential Commission on the Holocaust, headed by Elie Wiesel, which led directly to the founding of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. For many years, Ambassador Eizenstat has dedicated his life to our country. It is such an honor to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, fellow Tar Heel, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat.
I really grow nostalgic when I come back to Chapel Hill, and I appreciate the invitation from Ambassador Stevenson, who really is one of our great diplomats, and having David Price, who's been my role model in the House of Representatives, here is also special. I wouldn't be here but for the work of Rhonda Manuel, who heads the Development Office in Washington, and I've had a very busy time here. Had breakfast with Dean Jim White and Ann Collins. I taught 2 classes today. Rob Jenkins's class on climate change and Karen Auerbach's on the Holocaust. So it's been a very full and rewarding day for me. I wrote this book for 3 reasons. First, at a time of great turbulence in the world, when we have seemingly insoluble problems, I wanted to demonstrate by this book that we met equally daunting problems over the last 50 years, solved them, and can do so again. Second, we're now in the midst of 2 hot wars in Gaza and Ukraine, with the threat of conflict always hovering over Taiwan. In our lifetimes, we've had the Vietnam War, 2 wars in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo, 2 wars in Iraq under Presidents Bush 1 and 2, the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, and the war in Libya imposed Muammar Gaddafi, which, by the way, President Obama called his biggest mistake. And so I wanted to take a hard look at when, how, and whether military force should be used to supplement diplomacy. And third, I fear that we're living in the beginning of an era of isolationism, not unlike that which we had between the First and Second World Wars, where we want to retreat behind our two oceans, thinking that the rest of the world will take care of themselves. And I wrote this book because I also wanted to show how critically important U.S. engagement is to build a better world, and that if we go back to isolationism, we will create a huge vacuum into which the Russias and Chinas and Irans and others with very different values and very different interests will fill, to the great detriment of ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Now, the art of diplomacy, and I call it an art because it is an art form, like a painter painting on an easel, is really convincing the other countries with whom you're negotiating that it's in their national interest to do what is in our national interest. It's to find the areas of compromise. It's not a game of poker where it's winner take all. It has to be a win-win situation because your opponent is another sovereign country that has to bring an agreement back to their leadership and to their public. And having that mentality is critically important to understand you're not there to humiliate your opponent, but to make your opponent a partner. The starting point for a successful negotiation is the President of the United States choosing the right person for the right issue at the right time. It's almost unthinkable to believe that we would have had the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or Camp David Accord between Egypt and Israel without Jimmy Carter, or the Dayton Accords without my late great friend Dick Holbrooke solving the war in Bosnia, or the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland without George Mitchell. Now, that in and of itself is not sufficient. Thinking there's some great knight on a white horse who's going to come in and solve all the problems only works if the parties with whom the negotiator is trying to negotiate themselves want an agreement and can find common ground for it. In interviewing 130 people for this book, virtually every Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA directors, ambassadors, foreign officials like Tony Blair, I found that there were a set of common skills that were necessary for a successful negotiator. The first is an absolute determination to catch a historical moment, to realize when there is a chance for an agreement because things have changed, and then the determination to drive that home. A good example is George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and no one anticipated that it would. He recognized that this was a historic chance to unite the two Germanys, one controlled by the Soviet Union, the other occupied by our wartime Western allies. And not only to unite them, but to do so within NATO. And this was a very, very heavy lift. Even with our own allies, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the UK Prime Minister, said, "I love Germany so much, I want two of them." There was a real fear of a united Germany at the heart of Europe's attribute is courage, not the courage of the soldier on the battlefield, but the courage to break from established patterns, to depart from what your own political base may insist on, to take the risk for peace. The best example is what happened in Northern Ireland. That conflict actually went on for almost 100 years, but the violence was in a 20-year period. What the British, in typical British understatement, called the Troubles. Well, the Troubles killed 3,500 people, Catholic and Protestant, and maimed over 10,000. And finally, the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant communities, the Unionists and the Nationalists, said enough is enough. Even though our publics may not want it, we've got to end this conflict and find a way to do it, and two of them got Nobel Prizes for doing so. Third is a high degree of intelligence, but combined with wisdom and judgment about people. And that is also something that Henry Kissinger, who wrote the foreword to my book, and Zhou Enlai, who was then the premier of China, showed in the opening to China. Next is preparation, just like doing your homework. It's knowing more about the issues, both on your side and the other, than anybody else at the negotiating table, so that you can find the areas of compromise. Example, we're in the 13th and last day at Camp David with President Carter, President Sadat of Egypt, and Prime Minister Begin of Israel. And Begin comes to Carter's cabin on the last Sunday, the 13th day, and says, Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. Get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting. I'm sorry that it didn't work. Well, Carter, realizing that this would undermine the unbelievably courageous act that Anwar Sadat showed in going to Egypt, from Egypt to Israel, in which he lost his own foreign minister, and he lost a second one at Camp David. If he came back empty-handed, he could be assassinated. Plus, it would be a blight on Carter's own record. Because of preparation, he had read thoroughly the CIA reports on Sadat and Begin and knew that Begin had a great soft spot for his 8 grandchildren. So he orders his personal secretary, Susan Cloud, to make 8 copies of the original photograph on day 1 taken by the 3 leaders, gets the names of each of the grandchildren and writes to each of them, with hope for peace, Jimmy Carter, goes over to Begin's cabin, gives those photographs to him, and sees Begin vocalize the names of each grandchild as Begin's eyes tear and his lips quiver, and he puts his suitcase down and said, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. That preparation was really absolutely critical. Next is developing a personal relationship. And that in and of itself requires also the ability to listen, as Barbara was saying, to the other side. Are they just mouthing talking points, or is this really their bottom line? And sometimes when you get into negotiation, you're so anxious about what you're going to say that you block out what they're going to say. You're so confident that what you have is the God's honest truth and what they have is not, that you miss hearing what they're telling you. You've got to be able to put yourself in their footsteps, in their shoes, and realize what they have to come back to their presidents and capitals to be successful. So, for example, 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Israel is on its heels, surprise attack, almost lost the entire war at that point. And finally, with U.S. help, with Nixon and Kissinger, counterattacks and has the Egyptian Third Army totally surrounded in the Egyptian Sinai. Now, Golda Meir is the prime minister. She was getting unshirted help for not being prepared. She ended up resigning later. But this was a chance for her to get back by destroying the cream of Sadat's army. Kissinger, standing in Sadat's shoes, says, Golda, you can achieve a short-term Pyrrhic victory by eliminating this army, but you will never get Sadat to make peace if you humiliate him. You've got to give him an out, which she did. That led to the disengagement agreements that he reached, and ultimately to Camp David. Next is creativity. And again, I call this the art of diplomacy because there's a creative notion that you have to have. You're always going to hit an impasse. You have to find a creative way of getting around it. So, in the Good Friday agreements, the armies of the two sides, the militias, were killing each other in the midst of the negotiation. And there were 13 parties, and the other party said, this is crazy. How can we negotiate if the two armies are armed? They have to disarm. But they refused because they didn't trust each other. So Mitchell creatively came up with something called the Mitchell Principles, which is you can keep your arms, but you have to sign a paper saying you're going to resolve your differences peacefully. And that created a way around the impasse. Next, having all of us watching the Olympics in Paris, Stamina is another critical ingredient for a successful negotiation, because these international negotiations are a marathon with a sprint at the end. They always take months, sometimes years, and always seem to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. So you've got to have the stamina to think clearly after all these exhausting episodes. The whole concept of shuttle diplomacy, which was a term coined about Henry Kissinger's tireless efforts in 1973 between Syria and Israel and Egypt, with almost no sleep. Jimmy Carter got an average of 2 hours sleep over 13 days. And when I was leading the Kyoto negotiations on climate change and the Clinton administration, we averaged about 4 hours of sleep. So stamina is also critical. Next, if I can switch sports analogies, and I don't have one for Carolina basketball, by the way, I'm sorry about that, but it's baseball now with the playoffs. And that is, a negotiator should avoid swinging for a home run and trying to get too much or you'll strike out. Go for singles, build on those. So, example, at Camp David, we did not solve the Palestinian problem, which of course still haunts us. But we got Egypt and Israel to agree to a bilateral peace agreement that's lasted now for more than 40 years through thick and thin. I really think if we had the Palestinians there, we wouldn't have gotten a bilateral agreement. Another example is, again, on Northern Ireland. There were really two great issues that George Mitchell, President Clinton, Tony Blair, and Bertie Ahern, the Prime Minister of Ireland, had to deal with. Number one, what's the future of Northern Ireland? Is it going to be part of the Irish Republic in the South, or will it stay as part of Great Britain? That was really the fundamental issue they've been fighting over for 20 years. At the Good Friday Agreement, they agreed that there would be a referendum to decide on whether they go to the South or stay with Great Britain. If a majority of the public wanted a referendum, well, here we are 20 years later, no referendum, never been a referendum, because the parties are satisfied that they've reached a way of living together and they're afraid that a referendum may go the wrong way. And again, it's a good example of not going for too much. In the agreement with Iran, if we had sought too much, like a limit on their missiles, we wouldn't have gotten a nuclear agreement. Then it's the use of what we call back channels. There are some times when the two sides are so antagonistic, they literally won't get in the same room together. So you have to have a back channel, a neutral party. The example of this is with the JCPOA nuclear agreement in 2015, where Secretary of State Kerry went to the Sultan of Oman, who had good relations with both Iran and the United States, who wouldn't get in the same room with each other, and that led to a breakthrough which otherwise wouldn't have happened. The Oslo Accords, the famous Oslo Accords between the PLO and Israel, was done through back channels. Literally, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, a great Prime Minister, did not know about the back channel, and it was presented to him as an almost finished product. Next, there is a real tendency by a new president to try to undermine whatever his predecessor, who he's beaten, has negotiated. And this is very dangerous because there's a lack of continuity in our negotiating stance. I'll give you two polar examples. We lost the 1980 election, we being Jimmy Carter, to Ronald Reagan overwhelmingly, and one of the arguments he used, among others, was that we had given away too much in our SALT II nuclear agreements to the Soviet Union and gotten too little for it. And yet, even though that treaty was never ratified by the Senate, Reagan realized that it represented a commitment by his predecessor, and he honored it for the whole 7-year period, and then built on it with a START treaty that had even deeper relations. Contrast that with what Donald Trump did. He inherited the nuclear agreement with Iran, and I know all the flaws, but it boxed in the nuclear agreement with Iran for 15 years. Trump pulled out of it, as he did the Paris climate change agreements, And he said, we're going to apply maximum pressure to Iran. Well, what have we got for it? Instead of 2.5% enriched uranium, which is civilian grade, they're now at 60% within weeks of military grade. Instead of dismantling 2/3 of their centrifuges, they now have a whole new generation of centrifuges spinning faster and faster for enriched uranium. It's a disaster to do it. So when you pull out of something your predecessor has done, there's a real cost to be had. And last, and we all know this from our own personal relationships with spouses, with partners, with children, with grandchildren, with friends, with business associates, and that is the ability to use leverage. Leverage is critical in negotiations. There are two types of leverage. There's positive leverage. Example, when the United Arab Emirates decided to normalize in 2020 relations with Israel, they went to the United States for a sweetener, which was to get F-35 fighter jets. Israel couldn't give them that. But that was the leverage that we had as mediators to get them to sign on the bottom line. Negative leverage is even more difficult. And there are three types of negative leverage. The first is economic sanctions. And the United States of America has more sanctions on more countries than all the countries in the world put together have against each other. We use it as a sort of default mechanism when we don't know what else to do. But look, economic sanctions, which I was in charge of during the Clinton administration, aren't what they used to be because we don't have monopolies on products. We have a sanction right now on Venezuela with Maduro. He's still there. We have sanctions against Russia. They're still fighting Ukraine. We have sanctions on China. They're still doing what they want. We have sanctions on Iran. They're going further on their nuclear program. So sanctions can have some impact, but limited. The second negative leverage is the threat of military force, not its actual use, the threat. So, for example, when Bill Clinton sent former President Carter and Colin Powell and Senator Sam Nunn, I think he served, David, at the same time you did on the Senate side, to Haiti in 1994 to convince the dictator who had staged a coup against a democratically elected prime minister. They were not able to reach a deal until Clinton actually started to send aircraft toward Haiti, and that threat of force made the difference. And then last and most significant and most difficult is the actual use of force. Having worked in 6 administrations, there is nothing more difficult, more trying, more taxing than a president committing American forces to war with young men and young women's lives at stake. So here are some lessons for the use of force. The first is that it should be the last option after you've exhausted everything else, negotiations, economic sanctions, and a threat of force. Second, make sure it's in the supreme national interest of the United States. Right now, we have a terrible genocide going on in Sudan. Terrible. Hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered. But it's just not sufficiently in our national interest to intervene. Third, and this is a really critical one that applies directly to Gaza today. And I got this from Steve Hadley and from Condoleezza Rice, who were the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State to George W. Bush with their deposing Saddam Hussein. And that is that we often get it back. We use military force first, and then we think about what the end result is going to be politically. And as Steve said, we have to do the opposite. Don't use force until you know that you can achieve a political objective that's better than the status quo. And as David Petraeus, the general, told me in one of his interviews, if you're going to intervene in another country, know the history, the culture, the politics of that country. Know, as he put it, the nuances. And we did not know that in Afghanistan, and we did not know it in Iraq. Also, recognize that when you use military force, there are always going to be unexpected costs. So, for example, in Kosovo, it took NATO 77 days of bombing Serbia to get them to the negotiating table. One of those days included the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. killing a number of Chinese diplomats. To this day, they think we did it on purpose. It's like former heavyweight champion Larry Holmes said, everybody has a great plan when they go into the ring until you get punched in the nose. So you're always going to have unexpected things happen. Next, and next to the last, is what Colin Powell told me. And that is, if you're going to intervene militarily, you have to use decisive force. Bush 1 got it right, his son got it wrong. So in the first Gulf War, where we were simply trying to get Saddam out of Kuwait, not change the regime, just get him out, George H.W. Bush got a UN resolution authorizing force, a NATO resolution authorizing force, a congressional resolution authorizing force. 38 countries contributed a total with our troops of 500,000 troops. Decisive force. Contrast that with what his son did 12 years later in the second Iraq War, where we were trying to depose Saddam Hussein and change the whole political order in the country. His Secretary of Defense said, we're going to achieve this with a quote-unquote light footprint. Just the opposite of decisive force. He took troops out of Afghanistan, where we had gone after 9/11, shifted them to Iraq, and we didn't have sufficient decisive force in either place. And last, if you're going to use force, have good intelligence. And let me give you some personal examples, one which is extremely painful. So first, in Gaza, 2 Israeli generals briefed myself and Dennis Ross, we chair an academic center in Israel, that they made one of the worst intelligence mistakes in their history. Namely, that Hamas had transformed itself from a terrorist group into a full-blown terrorist army. Well-trained, organized by battalions, well-armed by Iran. And yes, they said we knew they had some tunnels, but not 300 miles of tunnels. Some as deep as 25 stories. Now, 2 other examples of bad intelligence. In the second Iraq War, we all may remember that the reason why President George W. Bush sold the second Iraq War was that there were weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. We found none, 0, after we invaded. What I learned in doing this book is Saddam actually did have weapons of mass destruction, but he had secretly destroyed them in compliance with UN resolutions. So why didn't he say so and save his life, his regime, and thousands of soldiers on our side and on Iraq's side? Because he was afraid if he admitted that he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction, his domestic opponents would have been emboldened and Iran might have invaded. And last, and very personal, so we're now in the Carter administration, and we get a report from the CIA 6 weeks before the Shah is forcibly deposed. Now remember, he was our man in that part of the Middle East. 6 presidents gave him an open shopping list, whatever he wanted. And what did that CIA report say? 6 weeks before he was forced to leave, it said that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary state. Now, how can a president make a good decision when he gets that kind of information? Not only that, they didn't realize, the CIA, that he had incurable cancer. Just a staggering lack of intelligence. So my conclusion is this. In order to strengthen American diplomacy, we have to maintain and strengthen our economic, our political, and our military capability. We have to end the kind of polarization that we have now, because it's very difficult to negotiate on behalf of the United States with another country when they can look, as Putin does now, at us and says, wait a minute, it took 6 months for you to get money for Ukraine. You're not going to do that again. So it gives him an incentive to continue the war. Having said that, diplomacy is still the best means to solve problems in the world, and we need to have more of it and more capable diplomats to do it. So thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Stu. That's a very, very concise and helpful tour through your rather thick tome, with many case studies of many incidents of American diplomacy, but with some threads that you've traced through that I think help bring it all together. And I would like to ask you a few questions that might do more of the same. The book, hardly recommend the book to all of you. It deals, as you've already picked up, with a range of the most important, or probably all the most important diplomatic exercises in this country's recent history, in a very provocative kind of framework, drawing lessons from them and conclusions about the art of diplomacy. As Barbara Stevenson said in her introduction, you come at this from experience both on the domestic side of the U.S. government and the foreign policy side. And there's subtle differences, I think, in the accounts you give of these cases, depending on what your vantage point was at the time. You clearly have firsthand information about. From a domestic point of view, you have first-hand information about the Carter administration, about the first Camp David Accords, about the Tokyo round of trade negotiations. And then you, of course, then have this foreign policy vantage point as assistant or undersecretary of state, ambassador to the EU, Holocaust representative, and other positions under Clinton and subsequent presidents. So, but I want to go back to those early cases where you were the domestic advisor and pick up on something you briefly alluded to. The political scientist Robert Putnam wrote a classic article years ago using the art of diplomacy as a prime example of what he called two-table games. Two-table games, that he was interested in, as you are, in the way that the diplomatic officials and leaders have to pay attention at one and the same time to the diplomatic objective, the foreign policy objective, and to the situation at home, which is going to perhaps make or break the deal. You refer to Robert Strauss, Jimmy Carter's trade negotiator, as the consummate practitioner of that two-table game. And Putnam agrees. He has an interesting quote from Strauss, which is right in line with your portrayal. During my tenure, he says, as special trade representative, I spent as much time negotiating with domestic constituencies and members of the U.S. Congress as I did negotiating with our foreign policy partners. He was extraordinarily successful at that. And you talk in the book about some very unusual things that he did in terms of bringing congressional staff members in to witness negotiations and kind of forming all these advisory committees and doing many, many things to smooth the way for the passage of this. You then also have examples of times when this didn't work, and where the two-table game was very, very difficult and in some cases failed. And you were close at hand with the Kyoto talks under President Clinton, the Kyoto climate talks. And the question, thus, we raise the question, what are the ingredients for success in this, and have the changes in our political environment made this whole thing much, much more difficult? It may be that our diplomats aren't just less adept at this, You know, maybe there are Robert Strausses around and maybe there aren't, but maybe even Robert Strauss would be frustrated and stymied by the current divisions we have in the body politic and the difficulties that we have in preparing the groundwork domestically. And then I guess the question that follows is, well, given that that's our reality, how do we adapt to it?
So in any international negotiation, you can't just have your head in the sky. You have to realize that ultimately you have to sell it to the American public and to the Congress. So let me give you a personal example. I led a 100-person delegation in the 2-week Kyoto negotiations. And before I left for the negotiations, the Senate voted 95-0. I mean, you can't get a motherhood resolution passed 95-0. And it was the Byrd-Hagel resolution. Byrd was the Senate Democratic Majority Leader. Senator Hagel was a Republican senator from Nebraska. And what that Byrd-Hagel resolution said is, do not bring us back from Kyoto any treaty that doesn't have some commitments by developing countries like China and India to do their part in dealing with global warming. Do something on, it doesn't have to be as much as the developed countries are doing, but it has to be something. And we found that we hit a brick wall in Kyoto. The worst meeting I think I've ever had is with the so-called G77 developing countries in Kyoto, where they literally were screaming at us, saying, you're the ones that polluted this planet, you're the ones that are causing the whole greenhouse problem. With your industrialization, how dare you tell us, just as we're beginning our industrial revolution, that we have to start cutting back on the emissions that you created? And they refused to participate. Now, what we decided to do is take half a loaf. We knew we couldn't get them, so we did the following things. First, we negotiated an agreement with the European Union, and I think creatively, I created something called the Umbrella Group, which included Russia and Australia and Japan and a number of other countries outside of the European Union, to be a counterweight against the EU, which was seeking ridiculously deep cuts in emissions and wouldn't let us use market mechanisms to reduce the cost. Ultimately, we were able to get that done, and it was a significant achievement, but we knew we could not get it ratified by the Senate. So what happened was President Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, but we never submitted it to the Senate. To this day, it's never been submitted. And now we've come up with a new creative way of actually getting developing and developed countries on the same track after the problems at Kyoto, and that is something called national development commitments. So we say to each country in the world, voluntarily, we're not putting any pressure on you, create and publish your own commitments about what you're willing to do. And we will then measure every 6 months if you've achieved that result, but it's purely voluntary. So that's the way Paris Agreement in 2015 actually worked. And the advantage is also that because it's voluntary, we don't have to submit it to the Senate. And yet we're getting countries to reduce emissions, we're reducing our emissions, without having it go to the Senate. I think it'll be a cold day in hell before the Senate, by a 2/3 vote, ratifies any climate change treaty. So we can't just bury our head in the sand. We've got to keep finding creative ways to make progress.
You're saying Clinton found such a way and really forewent the possibility of Senate ratification.
Yes, and then Obama, when he came in, did the Paris Agreement with John Kerry, And under the Paris Agreement, we came up with this concept of national climate commitments, which are voluntary, yes, but there's a reputational damage. If China, for example, China has said, and this is an enormous breakthrough, China at Kyoto in 1998 was just vicious and attacking us. Don't tell us what to do. You're the ones that caused the problem. Right? Well, today, China is the #1 emitter in the world, more than we are. And so their own publics are demanding action because their air is so unclean. So China has made a national commitment, public commitment, that by 2060, yes, that's a long time, by 2060, they will have net zero emissions compared to pre-industrial times. And India says they'll do it by 2070. Now, I know that that sounds a long way off, but they will have benchmarks for the next several years to measure that.
So that counts as a creative adaptation to
It's a creative adaptation,
situation that.
but it's also going for a single and not a home run.
I wonder though what the losses are by virtue of, for example, not submitting agreements to the Senate any longer. I wonder if there's any kind of agreement. First of all, you can imagine the Senate ratifying these days. What would it take? It's not easy to imagine that. But when you think about the JCPOA, for example, where going in, there was a deep partisan division. There was never any thought that that agreement would be submitted to the Senate. In fact, our work in the House and the Senate was to organize enough members to uphold a veto of a resolution of disapproval. That's a rather convoluted mechanism, but it isn't Senate ratification. And it suggests, that this was a less well-established agreement by virtue of that, and therefore Trump perhaps had an easier time pulling out.
So let me say this about the U.S. system. The Founding Fathers purposely created, because of the Revolutionary War and having a king who was suppressing the colonies, they purposely created a system of government that divided power. So you have an executive branch headed by the president, and then, of course, the judicial branch, but then you have a legislative branch which is totally separate. And it itself has two houses, the Senate and the House, because they were afraid of too much power in the hands of any one person. Well, they did a splendid job, so good that we can't get anything done. It's extremely difficult with the partisanship we have now. Now, in the Carter administration, in my book, President Carter, the White House Years, we got many things done on energy, on the Panama Canal Treaty, where we got 2/3 of the Senate to agree to a treaty that initially had 14 senators in favor of it. We had 67. But today, we see the opposing party as not your honorable opponent, but as your enemy. The enemy within, we've got a presidential candidate talking about. And with that type of attitude, it's extremely difficult to have the kind of bipartisan support that you need to make our government function and to back our diplomats up when they go to show that we have some degree of unity. In addition, and this is your generation, I mean, I grew up, David grew up, in an environment where we got our news from 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And, the Walter Cronkites and David Brinkley's, basically, the facts were similar. Senator Pat Moynihan, great senator from New York, once said, everyone in this country is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. Well, now we do not operate from a common body of facts. If you look at Fox and MSNBC, you get 2 different worlds. So it complicates governance hugely when you have this kind of environment. And again, makes it more difficult for diplomats to represent the United States because the opponents see us as so divided and they play on those divisions. I mean, Putin is just waiting us out on Ukraine. That's absolutely what his strategy is.
I was just in Guatemala on a House Democracy Partnership visit and found that Guatemalan leaders give this administration and its diplomacy a great deal of credit for a reformist president being seated in Guatemala when there were lots of forces trying to derail that. But they too are waiting us out because they think the pressures to abide by democratic norms are likely to, whether that pressure exists or not is likely to depend on who the U.S. president turns out to be.
And we also oftentimes get finally so anxious to get out of a conflict that we negotiate behind the back of the governments we're supporting. Two examples. Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Prize for Peace for negotiating the end of the Vietnam War. But it was really not a peace agreement, it was a withdrawal agreement. And he negotiated with the North Vietnamese government, and the South Vietnamese government in Saigon was never in the room. More recently, with Afghanistan and the Taliban, when the Trump administration, Pompeo and his designated ambassador, negotiated with the Taliban, the Afghan government, for whom we spent 20 years defending, was never in the room. And then we wondered why, when we pulled out, the government collapsed. They weren't party to the negotiations. And with Zelensky and Ukraine, we've got to make sure we don't do the same thing.
You worked very closely with many presidents, first of all Carter and then Clinton and then subsequent presidents, but especially you're in the position of high authority under both Clinton and Carter. So one of the most interesting aspects of the book is the portrait one gets of these presidents. And you describe some of these presidents as really getting in the weeds on diplomacy and to an incredible degree, others floating above that. You talk about staff advice that was sometimes not taken about whether a president ought to go in this direction or that, usually in the way of micromanaging negotiations. You talk about the instances where the presidential initiative was absolutely essential to the success. You have other examples where there was perhaps presidential overreach or investment of too much politically. Just with that teaser, could you reflect a bit on what you think what are the relevant categories for assessing presidential performance in diplomacy, and what kind of in what terms would you compare the performance of the presidents you've worked with?
Well, I'm going to compare Carter and Clinton, but let me start by saying that if the President of the United States is not full bore in support of his designated diplomat, the negotiations will never succeed. The other side has to know that when you put an offer down, you're putting an offer down in the president's name. Now, there are different styles, and you couldn't have more different styles than Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. So I worked for Jimmy Carter as his policy director when he ran for governor and for president, and then for 4 years as his chief domestic advisor. We wouldn't have had Camp David if he hadn't so thoroughly prepared and drafted himself 22 draft agreements before you do it. But President Carter had a very odd view of governing, which was, in campaigning for the presidency in 1975 and 76, he was indefatigable in retail politics. He spent 100 days in Iowa before the caucus. I mean, it was just brutal. We used to see him every other weekend back in Plains to get debriefed. He was a great retail politician. But when he got into office, and you have a perception of this perhaps from the position of the House Representatives, his notion was, if I do the right thing for the country, at the end of the day, the politics will take care of themselves. And he did not combine politics and policy. He didn't recognize that the president is not only the commander-in-chief, he's the politician-in-chief. And that's one of the reasons why we had a challenge from Ted Kennedy, because he didn't nurture the Democratic Party. We did have a very good legislative record, but again, it was an odd combination. Jimmy Carter's, the best way I've described his notion of governing was his favorite Christian theologian was Ronald Niebuhr, who said, it's the sad duty of politics, the sad duty of politics, to do justice in a sinful world. That was sort of his view. Bill Clinton was exactly the opposite. He loved politics, he loved people, he loved schmoozing, he loved all the backroom compromises that had to be done. He just was in, it was like a pig in a sty. He loved doing it. And unlike some presidents, and by the way, I think Obama was closer to Jimmy Carter's view of the presidency, more academic, didn't really like members of Congress that much. Bill Clinton was the opposite. One other anecdote, which is interesting, is that Jimmy Carter had come through the submarine force in the Navy under Admiral Rickel. And he was a stickler for details. We would get memos back with grammatical and spelling mistakes. Certain. And also, if a meeting was to start at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it did not start at 4:01. And if you came in at 4:01, you got a nasty look. On the other hand, we had what we called Clinton time. If a meeting was scheduled at 4 o'clock, if he came in at 5 o'clock, you were lucky. And part of the reason was not that he was sleeping, quite the contrary, that he got so engaged in his previous meeting that he just couldn't pull himself away. So presidents have very different negotiating styles, and each has its own pluses and minuses.
Both of these presidents, though, were certainly proactive diplomats.
Both were proactive.
And
Both were internationalists.
Got into the details.
And both believed in the U.S. as a positive force in the world, and both got into details. So when I did Kyoto, I constantly called back to the White House that was getting cues from the president. You can go this far, you have to get this from the other side. So he was very deeply involved and called me afterward to congratulate me.
Well, speaking of Clinton's style, I, over the years, was fortunate to many times host the Carolina basketball team when they had won a national championship to come to the White House. And typically, the president, George W. Bush comes to mind, would come in a very clipped style, spend a few minutes, and then he was out of there. We were glad to see him, but he was out of there. He wasn't going to hang around. With Clinton, we had to get him out of there. It was incredible. He would come and talk with every single player, and he would just, we were ready to go before he was.
So when he named me Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, he invited my whole family, which then included a 2-week-old baby, into the Oval Office, and then we went into the Rose Garden. And afterward, when everybody had dispersed, he was sitting there taking pictures with the baby.
Well, before we turn to the audience, let me ask you one more question. Or do I have one more, Barbara?
One more.
One more. All right. This book recounts in a very very skillful way some of the very biggest diplomatic achievements in our recent history. And Stu has referred to a number of those. It opens with the opening to China under Nixon. There's also insightful discussion of the backing of German reunification under the first George Bush, the Good Friday Accord with George Mitchell playing a skillful diplomatic role, the ending the years, decades of conflict in Ireland. Those are just major diplomatic episodes. In retrospect, they tend to be viewed very positive politically, and they're not particularly partisan. I think that's fair to say. I wonder if it was always that way, though, and what the backstory might be on some of these efforts in terms of what it took to build political support and enhance the acceptability to all sides of what were very bold and daring diplomatic moves in some cases.
So I said to the class that Professor Jenkins' class on climate change this morning, that one of the problems we have in negotiating climate change agreements is that there is no continuity in our commitments. It depends on who wins the last presidential election. So George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Trump were all opposed to binding commitments on emissions. The Democratic presidents, Clinton, Obama, Biden, just the opposite. So when we go to China and we say, you need to do more now, you're the number one emitter, don't give me this business of being a developing country. You've got the second biggest economy in the world. We don't have any credibility when they say, well, look at your election coming up in 2 weeks. I mean, if one or the other candidate wins, they'll back out of Paris completely. He called climate change a hoax. So without some kind of domestic, agreement on these issues, it's extremely hard to negotiate. Now, I'll give you one other attribute that's actually can be useful, and so sometimes it's humor. So put yourself in this situation. Kissinger and Nixon did open relations with China, but they didn't establish formal diplomatic relations because the Taiwan lobby in the Republican Party at the time was against any recognition of China formally because of the communist leanings. So we did with Carter. We broke relations with Taiwan, created a separate Taiwan Relations Act, and Deng Xiaoping comes to the White House after that. And I looked at this guy, he was 4'11", and I said, how does this guy control 1 billion Chinese? So we get into the cabinet room, and he says to the president, thank you for this historic restoration of diplomatic relations, the first since World War II. But what I really want is I want special trade preferences for Chinese goods that will be the lowest tariff levels that you get to your best allies. And he said, I know that there's a problem with something called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which said you could not get that lower rate if you were a country that barred immigration. Well, he said that was aimed at the Soviet Union, Mr. President, because they won't let Soviet Jews out. He said, I will let Chinese out of our country, to your country. And he takes the little notepad, says White House, Washington, with a pencil, pushes it over to Carter in a cabinet room, and says, now you write on this notepad how many Chinese you'd like us to send you each year, 1 million, 10 million, 20 million? And Carter laughs and says, I'll tell you what, I'll take 10 million Chinese if you'll take 10,000 American journalists.
Let me get a show of hands if you think you might like to ask a question. So we are going to get you, if you want to ask a question, please come to the mic over there or over here. Here we go. And we'll get you started. I'm going to ask you to please say your name and what you're majoring in.
Hello. Is that audible?
Good.
First of all, good evening, Ambassador Eizenstat and Congressman Price. Thank you so much for coming and giving us this wonderful talk. My name is Rishi, and I'm a political science and public policy major. And my question is about something you mentioned in the start, where you kind of touched on how we are delving into economic populism in a sense. You didn't really say it, but I felt a bit of an implication, where we know that free trade is the best thing for Americans because we get like cheaper goods and we can spend on other things. But when we look at how free trade has impacted our country negatively, like our own industries in some cases, blue collar workers, as well as an in-state example with the furniture industry in High Point being completely, if not eliminated, at least being reduced by great impact. How do we convince Americans that free trade is the best way possible when we are losing jobs?
Barbara, I'm not sure I heard that fully.
I'm not sure about that either. Can somebody else give me the,
Could you speak closer to the mic?
Yes.
Thanks.
So I'm sorry.
That's much better.
Perfect.
Close.
So I think my question was, how do we convince the American people that free trade is the best for them when we see that Americans are losing jobs?
How do we convince the American people that free trade is good for them when they see the
That's
loss
really a
of
good
American
question.
jobs?
Americans have seen the plant closures in the industrial Midwest as being caused largely by free trade agreements with developing countries that have lower wage scales that they can't compete against. Now, the fact is, most academic studies show that a substantial reason, maybe the most important reason, is just technology, which is displacing workers. But you can't get angry at your computer. You can get angry at the Chinese or others. And we have gone from a situation, and David, it's true when you were in Congress. So let's take the negotiation of two agreements that I was involved in. One was the Uruguay round with the European Union and 100 other countries. The other was NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. We got those and other trade agreements done in the Clinton administration with a minority of Democrats because of the union base and the concern they had about jobs, and a heavy majority of Republicans who were free trade by definition because it was good for business. What's happened now is really, in my opinion, sort of a tragedy. Both parties have now become, under President Trump, he's made the Republican Party into a protectionist party and not a free trade party. And getting any trade agreement done is virtually impossible. Now, let me show you how this hurts. We're all concerned about the rise of China and their influence in Southeast Asia and beyond. I was on the Defense Policy Board in the Obama administration. What China has done in the South China Sea is they've taken 3 coral reefs and built them out into full military bases with runways and everything for their planes. And then declared that in a 14 nautical mile circumference around those islands that it's their territory. They do things like this, they're very, very tough to deal with. So with trade, we were going to negotiate something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, with 12 Asian Pacific countries. And this was going to give us leverage economically against China. What happened was we gave up on TPP because the unions and others were against it. And it's a shame because we would have lifted these Asian countries up to our environmental standards and our labor standards. And it was a huge missed opportunity. So what did China do? They moved in with their own regional trade agreement. And many of the countries we would have had in ours, they had in theirs, but with no environmental standards and no labor standards. So trade has a national security component too. And we are fighting in the world with one hand tied behind our back to be in such a protectionist mode that we won't pass any trade agreements.
Thank you.
That was a great question. Thank you. You, sir.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned in math major. I know you have extensive experience through multiple fields. when you entering a new region or new industry, how do you quickly familiar yourself and adapt to it? And are there any skill or mindset you think are best to develop early in career? Thank you.
I'm sorry, Barbara,
In your career?
Yes.
what was this? I'm sorry.
He's a math major, and he's asking about when you're moving into a new career and a new industry, did you say?
Yes.
What are the skills you would focus on in developing?
Yeah, so look, all of you are going to live in an extraordinarily different era than I'm in and that even your parents are in. And that is the era of artificial intelligence. This is going to be enormously challenging for the jobs of the future. And in order to operate in this environment, you're going to probably end up having 3 or 4 different careers. You're going to have to continue to be retrained. You're going to have to learn new skills. And we don't have the training infrastructure in this country that we should. So I think that it is an enormous challenge. There are going to be whole professions. I mean, for example, a pathologist who looks at tissues to determine if it's cancer, or an X-ray technician. AI is going to be able to do that better than human beings will do. I don't know about associates in my law firm. We tell them to write a brief. You can go to AI and get maybe not now, but in 2 or 3 years, better research. So it's going to be an enormous challenge. Now, in Europe, and I was ambassador to the European Union, so I lived there for several years. There are a couple of countries, especially Germany and Switzerland, that do it right. So at the age of 16 in Germany, you go on one of 2 paths, a college path or a work path. And the work path is a work-study path. So you go into what would be sort of like a community college, but you're given a job at the same time in industry. And when you come out of that 2-year program, and the community college type of atmosphere as the apprenticeship program, over 80% of the people get a permanent job in that place. What do we do in our country? Okay, 50% of the people, young people, go to college, and 50% don't. We put all of our educational resources in the 50% who do. Pell Grants for low-income students, for example. We're talking about now wiping out student debt. Well, the young people who don't get on a college track, we just abandon them. I mean, you want to know where there's frustration in this country? It's that reason. They feel absolutely abandoned. And we need to adapt to this and develop our own apprenticeship programs in which we're teaching them the skills of the future that don't necessarily require a college degree.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anthony Pecco. I'm a Peace, War, and Defense major. I noticed you mentioned multiple times kind of throughout speaking and answering questions how much of an issue partisan divide is in just diplomacy in general, especially nowadays where you can see presidents flip-flopping policy so quickly. What solutions do you have in mind for that, or are there any?
So first of all, let me talk about personal relationships and give you an example that I didn't mention. So Jim Baker, who was George H.W.'s Secretary of State, is involved in this extraordinarily difficult German reunification program. And the Soviets had lost 20 million people in World War II. And Baker realizes that he's got to develop not just putting himself into his foreign minister, the Soviet foreign minister's shoes, Shevardnadze. He's got to develop a personal relationship. I developed it in my Holocaust negotiations. Carter developed it with Sadat. So what he did, Baker, is he invited Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, to come to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he had a lodge. He got away from the press, away from Moscow, away from Washington. They developed a real personal bond. They talked about peace in Europe for their children, their grandchildren, and that really broke the ice. It was absolutely critical. So these personal relationships are hugely important. And when they don't happen, you're going to have trouble. So at the Camp David II summit, where the Prime Minister of Israel in 2000, with Bill Clinton and Arafat, offered 95% of the West Bank, and East Jerusalem was a capital. But he and Arafat did not hit it off. There was no trust, and Carter didn't hit it off with Arafat. So unlike Camp David I with Carter, where there was that sort of personal contact, it just didn't happen, and that can really be fatal. It sounds almost naive to say, well, is that enough? No, it's not enough, but it's absolutely critical to develop that kind of relationship.
So this was a great diplomatic discussion. It's kind of what this whole series is really about, bringing thought leaders and foreign affairs practitioners to us for this firsthand look at how to find global solutions to some of the grand challenges of our time. I love the part about listening carefully to the other side, but I think the other takeaway for me is when Ambassador Eizenstat spoke at the opening about how serious these challenges were during his career, and that over and over again, we found creative ways to overcome them, and that we have to know and believe that we can do that. If we have all these right characteristics, we need stamina, we need to be really well prepared. You're Carolina students, you are getting well prepared. But that is one of the things we hope the Diplomacy Initiative helps you kind of take away, is that seemingly intractable, insoluble problems, they can be solved. It is worth studying how they've been solved because, as I often like to say, we're counting on you guys. Now,
If I may, let me just end with one clip on Ukraine.
please.
It reinforces some of the points. I think that there will not be a formal peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. What there will be, I think, and this is just my guess, there'll be an armistice agreement like we had ending the Korean War between North and South Korea. There's never been a peace treaty between the two of them. Never in 70 years. But there's a demilitarized zone, which is honored, and there's never been a conflict. And I think what will happen here is we will have an armistice at wherever as much territory as Ukraine can get back, but not 100% of it. And we should, under the armistice, not recognize any territory that Putin has captured by force. We should not let off any economic sanctions, but we should just have a sort of permanent armistice. Now, I talked about being in someone else's shoes. So let's close this by putting yourself in Zelensky's shoes, okay? So let's say we're finally at a negotiating table when both sides are mutually exhausted from fighting. And Henry Kissinger said to me in his interview, you can't win at the negotiating table what you don't achieve on the battlefield. Okay, so now let's presume a year from now, 2 years from now, not more than that, they're negotiating. And Zelensky says, you know, you Americans have a proverb, and it is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And he says, we've been fooled by Putin twice. 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia got Ukraine to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a promise that he wouldn't take any further territory from Ukraine, which he broke and took Crimea. Okay, second time, we ourselves, the United States of America, signed on the line that we would, this was when in the so-called Minsk I and II agreements in 2014 and 2015, to end the fighting in the very area which is now being fought over in the Donbass area. And we, quote unquote, assured Ukraine that if they stopped fighting and Russia reinvaded, we would come to the defense, which we didn't. So, okay, now he says, well, wait a minute. What am I supposed to do now? You've already twice said you would do things that you won't. How do I know that Putin won't just rest, reload, and start all over again? You're not going to let me into NATO immediately to get an Article 5 mutual guarantee of defense. So what do? Okay, I think there's not a great answer to that, but I think the following is the way I would close. Number one is that we should expedite their entry into the European Union. There's not a mutual defense agreement among the 27 European Union countries, but it will be very hard for Putin to invade an EU country. Number two, we should have bilateral agreements, not to come to Ukraine's defense like Article 5, but to arm Ukraine, as Biden did in an agreement just a couple of months ago, and I hope Germany and France and the UK do the same thing. So we give them the arms to defend themselves. And third, there are today about 150 NATO trainers in Ukraine, and perhaps keeping them there may be a tripwire. But in the end of the day, we're going to have some trust by Zelensky that again, we won't have yet a third war.
Intractable problems, solutions proposed. This is our thing. So before we thank our guests, just a few instructions here. I'm going to escort our guests out into the atrium where pizza will be available. And Ambassador Eizenstat and Congressman Price were both have kindly agreed to meet you and talk to you and answer additional questions. Ambassador Eizenstat has also agreed to sign books. There's going to be books for sale if you'd like to buy one. So please hold on and in your seats till I've escorted them out so we don't hold them in here, and then come on out and join us for the pizza reception. Please.
So the book is food for thought rather than a pizza.
Please join me in a large round of applause for Congressman Price and Stuart E.